Was professional wrestling something you were into as a kid before you got that call?
It's a great question. And so that's the irony. Yeah, I was familiar with it for a couple of reasons. Vern Gagne and the AWA was headquartered in Minneapolis. And so it was on local TV every weekend. I wasn't an avid viewer per se. You might flip through the channels and see a match or two, and I'm like, yeah. Because I wasn't a fan. I wasn't a fan or interested in amateur wrestling either. Although the high school coach Pete Grigelko tried to talk me into going out for it, but I just had no interest in it. And the other reason I was familiar with it was at one point in college, I was in Minneapolis. I was working out at a gym called Ventura's Gym. Does that name
Yep, Jesse.
Jesse the Body Ventura, right? So,
Hmm.
working out at his gym, about 25 of us muscle heads, got to know him. My one and only live wrestling event was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he was actually doing a deadlift competition against who would later become the manager of the Road Warriors, Paul Ellering.
Hmm.
And there were about 18,000 people in that arena that night, Stanley. There was about 17,975 fans of Paul and 25 fans of Jesse.
Wow.
Us. And we were not well received. That was my first taste of a live pro wrestling event. So no, I wasn't, I didn't grow up dreaming of being a pro wrestler.
Yeah, I mean, you're making that transition, we're talking about bodybuilding and fitness to football to wrestling, different kinds of crowds, was it hard transitioning from football to wrestling?
So I guess because of my athletic abilities, my skills, Ivan Koloff, who, Uncle Ivan Koloff, who him and his partner Don Kernodle became my mentors, my trainers, if you will. I essentially had on the job training. Anyone who, if you're not familiar with my story, again, I had no amateur wrestling background, but I didn't have any professional training either. My sights were set on pro football. So when I got that phone call from Road Warrior Animal, and I made an ensuing phone call to Jim Crockett in Charlotte, North Carolina, had a 5-minute conversation with him, made sure he understood I had no experience. He said that wasn't required. I said, okay. So he said, be in my office on such and such a day with your head shaved bald. I go, that's it. And he goes, that's it. I said, okay. Showed up the day he said to be there, walked in, met Don Kernodle, Ivan Koloff, and they stuck me right on the interview set after giving me some options for names. Nikita Koloff is born in the hallways of Charlotte in 1984. We wrap up the interviews in Stanley. They're like, be in Raleigh, North Carolina tomorrow night. You're going to wrestle on television. Well, no pressure there, right?
Hmm.
Um, they showed me some basic things in the dressing room. 11 seconds later, had my first win in professional wrestling. For the next couple 3 months, Ivan, Don, and I would get to the towns early. They would bump and thump all over the ring, teaching me the mechanics of wrestling. And then I'd sit in their corner, watch their world tag team match every night. And then on the drive home every night, we talk about that old school psychology of wrestling. And that's how I learned. Trial by
Yeah.
fire.
Yeah, I mean that knowledge is very important. You want to learn, as much as you can, from the veterans, the people that have been there for a long time. And so what were some of the things that you learned from them that stuck with you throughout your career?
Well, again, if I go back to the psychology now, it's a different product now than it was then. I mean, it's still obviously very popular, but it's a completely different product. Back in that era, that many of the fans, when I'm out doing autograph signings, I was just recently in Sevierville, doing a 2-day autograph signing up there at Rise Up Con, and what I hear from the fans most of the time is that was the golden era of wrestling, and there was a real psychology or Stanley, a real art to the business in this regard. we might have been we were typically given an outcome, and then we had to for the next really for the next depending on how long the match was. I mean, if I'm wrestling Ric Flair for 60 minutes, 55 of those minutes are spontaneous. Like we might not even talk or meet until we get in the ring because the venues back in those days, a lot of times we were at opposite ends of the building, separate dressing rooms, never even talked to each other or saw each other until we got in the ring. And then through verbal and nonverbal cues, spontaneously we would tell a story so you the fan would be drawn into the story and it would lead into that outcome that a promoter or what they call the booker would determine what that outcome was. And so to be schooled by Ivan Koloff, one of the legends of pro wrestling, and Don Kernodle, he didn't have maybe necessarily as big a name over the course of his career, but he was still very schooled in the art of wrestling, and he had an amateur background. So that was beneficial as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you're in there, you really have to learn all kinds of techniques in order to really become good at your craft. So for you, I'd imagine like training was just brutal.
Well, so the of course obviously I maintain my daily regimen of 2 hours, 3 hours in the gym, and then sitting in the corner every night and watching their match, and then driving home able to say, why did you do that series of moves or those moves at that time? And for them to be able to explain that and then maybe go out the next night and try to perfect that or implement into them my own match is what I would try to do, Stanley. And little by little, I was able to implement a lot of those things into the matches and perfect them to a degree. And so again, I can't give enough credit to Ivan and Don and later on a few others, Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, at Rock and Roll Express, Ricky and Robert, and others, Dory Funk Jr., guys that was masters of their craft that I had the privilege of wrestling early in my career that helped lead to the success of my career.
Yeah.